Imagine being in a room, right? Decisions are being made that affect trillions of dollars, millions of lives. But the actual facts, the reality of this unfolding crisis, they're being debated, sometimes flat out denied.
Yeah, it's an incredible scenario. You have this group, incredibly smart people with tons of data trying to navigate a situation that's just fundamentally unstable, shifting under their feet.
Exactly. It's not just about the numbers. It's the human process, isn't it? Making sense of absolute chaos.
That's the core of it.
And this discussion takes us right into that room behind the scenes of, well, one of the most critical periods in recent economic history, how the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Central Bank, handled the 2008 financial crisis.
And we're drawing heavily from Mitchell Abolafia's book, Stewards of the Market. It's fascinating stuff.
It really is. What makes it so unique is that it uses verbatim transcripts from the Federal Open Market Committee meetings, the FOMC. These are the actual private conversations where these huge decisions happen.
It gives you this incredibly intimate look, really unparalleled, at how experts grapple with just profound uncertainty.
So our goal here for you, the listener, is to kind of unpack the Fed's sense-making. How did they actually interpret this ambiguous, fast-changing environment? What were the conflicting views? How did they finally adapt?
And hopefully provide some aha moments about making decisions under extreme pressure.
Definitely. And for those of you who really like to dig deeper into how complex information gets processed, how to foster rational thought, check out Mindful Moments on our YouTube channel. It offers AI book analysis, really good for reflection and critical thinking. Kind of complements what we're talking about here.
Good point.
Okay, so to really feel the pressure in that room back in 2008, we need a bit of background on the Fed itself. Its DNA, you could say. How did this institution, meant to be the rock of stability, even come about?
Well, what's really interesting is how it was literally forged in the fires of earlier financial chaos. Its roots go back to the Panic of 1893, and maybe even more importantly, the Panic of 1907.
1907, right. That was the one J.P. Morgan tried to stop.
Exactly, and he couldn't. Not single-handedly. His inability to rescue the banking system back then was the critical incentive for creating a central bank, something that could provide an elastic currency, basically manage the money supply when cash just dried up during panics.
So born out of this fundamental need for systemic stability, and it started off run by regional bankers.
Initially, yes, but that sort of banker control gradually faded over the 20th century.
Okay.
By the 1950s, you see the shift towards more technocratic control, decisions driven more by economic experts, by data, not just banking interests. The Treasury-Federal Reserve Accord in 1951 was huge here.
Right. That gave them independence over monetary policy.
Precisely. It affirmed the Fed's discretion, allowing it to adapt to economic cycles, act based on conditions, not just, political wins or Treasury demands.
And that brings us to their core job today, the famous dual mandate.
Maximum employment and stable prices. That's the legal requirement.
Which must be incredibly difficult to balance, especially when things go sideways like in 2008.
That's the absolute crux of it. That dual mandate shapes every decision. It's the lens through which they try to make sense of everything, even chaos.
Okay, so now let's get into the thick of it. Mid-2007, the storm clouds are gathering. How did the Fed actually see things? The book paints a really striking picture of disagreement.
Yeah, and it raises that big question. How do policymakers even agree on the facts when the information is so varied, so contradictory, especially when it clashes with their long-held beliefs about how markets should work?
So, August 2007, there are worrying signs in the financial markets, right? But the FOMC keeps interest rates steady at 5.25%.
Their main worry, their stated predominant policy concern, was still inflation. The risk that inflation will fail to moderate as expected, even though, as we know now, the recession had technically started by December.
So a real status quo bias. Stick with what you know, focus on the familiar threat, inflation.
Seems like it. And you had members pointing to what they saw as disparate facts. Jeffrey Lacker, for instance, mentioned continuing good news on inflation, called the global economy, hotter than a $2 pistol.
Wow. Hotter than a $2 pistol. That paints a picture, focusing on those standard indicators.
Right. Indicators that looked okay while these alarming signals from the financial system were starting to, bubble up underneath.
And the book says there were basically three competing narratives, three different ways of seeing the situation, battling it out inside the FOMC.
Exactly. These were the mental models they were using. First, you had the contagion narrative. This was rooted in anxiety, a fear that the financial turmoil would spread like wildfire.
The domino effect, people?
Pretty much. Folks like Timothy Geithner, Donald Cohn, They saw a non-negligible chance of a prolonged and very messy adjustment period. Bernanke himself was puzzled, wondering aloud how $100 billion in subprime losses could somehow morph into multiple trillions of dollars of losses in paper wealth. He sensed a potential vicious cycle.
But this view wasn't dominant.
Right. Not at first. It was seen as unsatisfying, tentative, and undeveloped. People weren't quite buying into the full systemic risk story yet.
Okay, so what was narrative number 2?
The restoration narrative. Total opposite. This was optimistic, based on this deep faith that markets fix themselves.
The self-correction belief.
Yeah, this positive theory actually saw the turmoil as potentially desirable, a healthy development, shaking out the excesses. It focused on how will it stop, assuming it would stop on its own, rather than asking the tougher question, why is this even happening?
That sounds like that Kahneman idea of substitution, answering an easier question.
Exactly. The underlying belief was markets are resilient, they'll sort it out. Intervention isn't necessary, maybe even harmful.
And the third narrative, the one that actually held sway.
The growth inflation narrative. This was the dominant narrative, the comfortable zone for central bankers.
Because it fit their main job description.
Right. Donald Cohn stressed the natural resilience of the economy, strong global growth. Bernanke summed it up. Risks to inflation remain to the upside. The main danger in this view was still rising prices, not some looming financial collapse.
It really sounds like, as the book argues, there were significant cultural blinders at play, deeply held beliefs shaping what they could even see.
That's one of the huge takeaways from Abolafia's work. This deep faith in self-correcting markets made it hard to accept the contagion idea, and the intense focus on inflation control burned into their institutional memory since the 70s heavily skewed their choices.
Bernanke even said the real economy's stability took precedence over the financial sector.
He did, explicitly reminding them of that priority. It shows how these ingrained beliefs act like filters, making it tough to register conflicting data even for brilliant economists.
And it wasn't just their mindset. Their tools were also falling short. The models they used.
Yeah, that was another big problem. Their standard macroeconomic models were described as rudimentary by people like David Stockton and Janet Yellen. They just couldn't properly feed the financial transmission mechanisms into the broader economic picture.
Meaning they couldn't predict how a Wall Street problem would hit Main Street.
Exactly. The plumbing wasn't mapped out in their models, and this created this real sense of unease, of uncertainty, which paradoxically led to inaction initially.
Because they didn't feel they understood it well enough to act.
Don Cohn said it plainly. I don't feel as though I know enough. The range of outcomes is just too wide. They were flying blind to some extent, and their usual maps were useless.
So this initial phase is marked by conflicting views, status quo bias, inadequate tools. How did things start to shift? How did they move towards actually tackling the crisis?
Well, you see this gradual, sometimes reluctant, but ultimately dramatic shift. They move away from that market-centric view, let the market sort it out towards a state-based logic, towards active intervention.
Okay, so fast forward a bit. December 2007. We know now the recession had started, but their models were still looking okay.
Still painting a pretty benign picture, yeah. The standard data wasn't screaming crisis yet.
But some individuals were seeing it?
Janet Yellen was. She gave this really stark, prescient warning about spillovers from finance to the broader economy. She saw that connection, that the financial mess wasn't going to stay contained.
Then January 2008, things really start to heat up. There's this redefinition of contagion.
Yeah, this is critical. Chairman Bernanke really takes charge. He pushes hard for an immediate rate cut. And crucially, he reframes contagion. It's not just about prices moving together anymore.
What is it then?
It's a psychological state of fear that was spreading. Suddenly, the language in the meetings changes. You hear members using words like fear, panic. Don Cohn talks about a vicious cycle. Kevin Warsh calls markets fragile, experiencing panic.
So the focus shifts from pure economics to market psychology.
Absolutely. The reason for acting becomes about managing that fear, trying to inhibit the panic, reassure markets. Tim Gaithner warns it would be irresponsible risk not to act. Dennis Lockhart talks about changing the spiral quality in market psychology.
Were there still doubters?
Oh, yeah. Jeffrey Locker worried they were just reacting to the stock market, setting a bad precedent, bailing out investors, essentially.
But the rate cut happened.
It did. An emergency 75 basis point cut. The vote was 8-1. Despite the reservations, they presented this united front, signaling they recognized the psychological danger.
And then comes March 2008. Bear Stearns. That felt like a real watershed moment.
Definitely. Bill Dudley called it an old-fashioned bank run, but driven by customers and investors, not just depositors. And it had significant contagion effects. The Fed cut rates again fast.
And this is where that state logic really takes over.
Yeah. Completely. Lacker was still arguing for market self-correction, a minority of one. But the majority, people like Thomas Honig, Don Cohn, they fully embraced this state-based logic. The central bank has to step in, lend boldly in a liquidity crisis.
Like the firefighters showing up because the building's on fire.
Exactly. Cohn's quote sums it up. We are in dysfunctional markets, and we have to try what we can to help them along. It was the clear victory of the state's role in ensuring order and stability over just letting market logic play out, especially in a panic.
Which brings us to probably the most controversial moment, Lehman Brothers, September 2008.
A huge turning point, and complex. This is where technocratic expertise really slams into political and cultural reality.
Because the Treasury and the Fed decided not to use public funds to save Lehman.
Right. Bernanke's initial explanation was that investors had time to prepare. He later called that a misjudgment and said Lehman was insolvent, making a Fed loan legally impossible.
But that's been challenged.
Yeah, significantly. Years later, a report by Lawrence Ball argued Lehman was solvent, had collateral, and could have potentially been saved or wound down more smoothly. It highlights the fog of war versus hindsight.
And the public reaction was intense.
Absolutely furious. You had headlines screaming about Wall Street bailouts while ordinary homeowners were struggling. It created this massive legitimacy crisis for the Fed. Public anger actually strengthened the let them fail market logic argument for a while.
Did the Fed feel boxed in?
Eric Rosengren basically said they had no choice once the Treasury refused to commit funds. And Bernanke himself later admitted not cutting rates before Lehman failed in that September meeting was a mistake. It shows just how fast they were learning, often painfully.
So after Lehman, the gloves really came off.
Pretty much. By October 2008, the growing concern narrative was global. They coordinated a 0.5% rate cut with 5 other major central banks. The understanding of just how interconnected and contagious this was had fully sunk in.
And this forced them into uncharted territory, didn't it? Unconventional tools.
Totally. Bernanke explicitly said they were moving away from the standard interest rate targeting approach towards new approaches. He stressed the experimental nature of what they were about to do.
Which was quantitative easing, QE.
The big one. Large-scale purchases of government bonds and other securities. The goal was to push down longer-term interest rates, inject liquidity directly into the system because the main interest rate was already near zero.
Like a massive injection of cash when the normal medicine wasn't working.
That's a good analogy. And alongside QE, they introduced forward guidance.
Telling the market what they planned to do.
Essentially, yes. Explicitly stating that rates would likely stay near zero for some time, trying to manage expectations, reduce uncertainty, provide some clarity in the storm.
By December 2008, what was the mood?
The implosion narrative was dominant, no more debating. Don Kahn talked about the economy in a steep decline, an intensifying feedback loop between finance and the real economy. Richard Fisher's analogy was stark, like chasing the anvil down the stairs. Very. So the FOMC cut the target rate to basically 0.25%, and made that famous commitment to employ all available tools to fight the crisis and restore growth.
The kitchen sink approach. And did it work? What was the outcome according to the book?
Well, the book points to the positive results. The Fed actually returned substantial profits to the Treasury from its interventions, around $100 billion by 2014. And by the time QE ended, unemployment was down significantly, inflation is still low, output was higher.
So not solely the Fed's doing, obviously, but their actions made a big difference.
The book argues their new regime, these unconventional tools, contributed significantly and were seen as highly effective, especially for a developed economy in such dire straits. It shows this impressive, albeit forced, adaptation.
So we've really traced this incredible journey inside the Fed during maybe its toughest test.
Yeah.
Watching them struggle to make sense of it all, shifting from, well, almost denial to really radical action.
Yeah, the book just illuminates that evolution of understanding, of action, when faced with just staggering ambiguity. It shows how this process of sense-making genuinely shapes outcomes and how institutions, even under immense pressure, can learn and adapt.
We saw them move from that initial optimism, that faith in markets, through growing anxiety, redefining contagion itself, eventually landing on bold international coordination and tools like QE they basically invented on the fly.
It was intense learning under fire, constantly bumping up against political realities, public perception, cultural beliefs that complicated purely economic logic.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? When things get truly complex, how much do the facts actually guide us versus how much our own beliefs, our narratives, shape what we even see as possible?
That's the lingering question. What does that mean for how you, listening now, approach ambiguity in your own world, in your work, your life? When the path isn't clear, what shapes your map?
Powerful thought. And if you found these insights valuable, remember to check out Mindful Moments on our YouTube channel for more AI book analysis to deepen that understanding. You can also find more of our podcasts, wherever you get your audio.
Definitely subscribe if you haven't. Maybe share this discussion with someone who enjoys digging into these kinds of complex stories.
And you can find a link to purchase the book we discussed, Stewards of the Market, by Mitchell Y. Abolafia, right there in our show notes. As always, keep thinking critically about the forces shaping our world.